In Jane Austen's 1813 novel Pride and Prejudice, the main action is centred on the Bennet family who live in Hertfordshire at their home in Longbourn. Some of the characters actually come from a little further afield. So today I want to concentrate on the wealthiest character in the book. Fitzwilliam Darcy, landowner and gentleman. He is definitely not from the south of England. His estate, Pemberley, is said to be in Derbyshire, which today is technically classed as the East Midlands, but the northern edge of Derbyshire is actually on the border with Greater Manchester, which many people think of as being in the north. In Jane Austen's time, Greater Manchester didn't exist. It's a new county. It would have been either Lancashire or Cheshire, so it's bordering into the north. He is definitely from some distance away from Hertfordshire. As a character, Darcy has some very good reasons to keep the details about his family private. Within 5 minutes of walking into that ballroom at Meryton, he knows that everybody is talking about him, and he doesn't enjoy it. He is a young man, he is handsome, he has a large estate in Derbyshire, and his childhood friend Wickham later describes it as a noble estate. Mrs. Reynolds, Darcy's own housekeeper, mentions that some of his land, which is probably neighbouring cottages and farms, land on the outskirts of the Pemberley estate, has been rented out to tenants, which is a totally normal thing for the nobility to do. Darcy's income is stated quite clearly as being somewhere in the region of £10,000 a year, possibly a little more. In today's terms, he would be a multi-millionaire. He was wealthy. Just a few months before we meet him, his childhood friend Wickham, who his father had loved like another son, tries to elope with Darcy's younger sister Georgiana, who is only 15 or so. No wonder Darcy is not comfortable around strangers. The whole purpose of all these details is merely to move the story along and set the scene for the revelations that come later. Let us suppose that Fitzwilliam Darcy is a real person. If we look at the book from that perspective, what does Pride and Prejudice actually tell us about his family history and the place that his family had in wider society? There are all sorts of clues, and I think we should have a look at them. So let us pick up on one of the first things that we learn about Darcy, which is that he has got this large estate in Derbyshire, Pemberley. How his family actually got their land at Pemberley and how long it had been in the family is never really stated exactly. It's not a significant detail in terms of moving the plot along. But in chapter 32, we are told that through the thoughts of Charlotte Lucas, now married to the Anglican clergyman William Collins, she makes a mental note that Darcy had considerable patronage in the church. Now she's interested in this because her husband is an Anglican clergyman. So whether the Darcy family were originally Catholic but decided that they would adopt the newer faith when it basically in the 17th century you really had to look like you were being Anglican at the very least, and maybe they converted to Anglicanism in order to keep their hands on their land, because many Catholics did get their land confiscated if they wouldn't conform or if they wouldn't take oaths of loyalty to the monarchy. Presumably the Darcy family thought it was prudent to do all these things if they were Catholic. and that's how they've hung on to the land, or the alternative is they've just conformed to the Church of England for the sake of a quiet life because they want to preserve their family estate, and why not? By 1811 or so, when the novel is set, it is absolutely clear that the Darcys are members of the Church of England. They could just as easily have been Catholic or maybe Quaker or something else. Perhaps Jane Austen has chosen to make them Anglican because, apart from anything else, her dad was an Anglican clergyman, so that was the kind of world that she knew. She was probably familiar with that environment, that world, that upbringing, so she has populated the world of her novels with people who seem to be members of the Church of England, and as far as I can make out, most of her novels are set in that kind of world. Darcy's house, Pemberley, is said to be a large, handsome stone building. Standing well on rising ground and backed by a ridge of high woody hills, it's near a river which we find out has got some trout in it. It is designed with real elegance. This is perhaps something that has been specially designed by an architect. There's a nice walkway by the river. There's a bridge over another part of it, a lawn outside the house, with Spanish chestnut trees and oak trees on it. This is something that may have been worked on perhaps by some sort of landscape gardener, and there were landscape gardeners like Capability Brown that became very famous, very popular, very in demand in the 18th century, so maybe the Darcys employed somebody with those sort of skills to beautify Pemberley even further. A full circuit of the park, the land surrounding Pemberley House, is said to be 10 miles around, so this is quite a sizable property. But nevertheless, it is not really a show-off's house. It just is naturally grand, if that is possible. It's not ostentatious. It doesn't need to show off, it just speaks for itself, which again is suggesting that the Darcy family have got some architectural taste, I think. Indoors we actually learn that there are various rooms. There is a hall, a library, a dining parlour, a saloon in a north-facing part of the house. There's a great staircase, and in some unspecified room a new piano has been installed. And that's just downstairs. On the upper floor we discover that there is a spacious lobby. There's a recently redecorated sitting room. Darcy has had this arranged for his sister Georgiana. There's a picture gallery which contains many good paintings and many family portraits, so that tells you a bit about the Darcys' place in the world. They are important enough that they can justify having family portraits painted, which would not be a cheap thing. And it's implied that there are more than 3 principal bedrooms, so if we then presume that somebody of Darcy's status would host guests, maybe there are as many as 12 or 14 bedrooms. It seems to be a large house, there's no shortage of space, there's no reason why there wouldn't be a dozen or so bedrooms for the accommodation of guests. Early in the novel, before we've even got anywhere near Pemberley, Miss Bingley tells us that, in passing, that a portrait of Darcy's great-uncle, the Judge, is hanging up in the gallery at Pemberley. That is a brother, probably a younger brother of Grandfather Darcy, or maybe it's the husband of Grandfather Darcy's sister. I would favour the first option. I think it is more logical to me that a portrait of a Darcy by birth would be hanging up in the gallery in the family's ancestral home. There's no reason it couldn't be a brother-in-law of Grandfather Darcy, but to me the brother connection is more logical. And maybe this portrait is telling us something else. The fact that it was ever painted in the first place, and the fact that it is still on display in places where visitors to Pemberley can see it, maybe suggests that he was somebody who had a distinguished career. He went on to do great things in the legal world, and in turn that perhaps implies that we're talking about a member of a family who was very well educated. Probably the judge was not the only member of the family in this generation to be well educated. Darcy himself is described as clever. His comment in chapter 9, "I have been used to consider poetry as the food of love," suggests somebody who is well read, and on numerous occasions in the early section of the novel he is mentioned to be spending his evenings reading, so he seems to like literature. Miss Bingley surmises that he must write many letters of business when she's pestering him, when he is not wanting to talk to her or walk around the room with her as she's proposing. He just wants to sit quietly and write a letter actually to his sister. Her implication that he must write many letters of business tells us that maybe we've also got somebody here who is quite hands-on about the actual running of his estate at Pemberley and managing whatever investments he's got, financial or otherwise. This is somebody who is responsible. This is somebody who has grown up understanding that with the status of landowner in charge of this great big house, Pemberley, comes a lot of responsibilities. He needs the skills to manage his property, he needs to make sure that his estates are earning him money, he needs to make sure that his tenants are looked after, his servants get paid. All these things would ultimately, he might delegate them to somebody else, but ultimately I think that he probably oversaw them. As for the servants that Darcy employs, well, we're never actually given a figure, which would certainly give us an idea of what sort of household a man with £10,000 a year could afford. I suspect there was a lot of servants. We're only explicitly told that he's got a housekeeper, a gardener and a steward. Mrs. Bennet speculates, I suppose he has 2 or 3 French cooks at least, which is not as outrageous as it might sound. A few years after the book was set, the Prince Regent, later King George IV, took on the very famous Marie-Antoine as his head chef. So it is possible that there were French employees in the kitchen at Pemberley at this point in time, but equally it's just as possible that Darcy chose to employ people who lived locally, were from Derbyshire and the surrounding area, so that he's helping to keep his neighbourhood employed. Mrs. Bennet's speculation that Darcy employs French cooks is actually no more than speculation as far as we can tell. We'll come back to who else he might have employed, but strangely enough it is the son of one of his employees who tells us a little bit more about what might have been found in the Darcy family archives, had they really existed. And as a family historian, I do love a collection of family papers. So let's see if we can work out what might have been in the Darcy's collection. It's perfectly possible that if the Darcys had owned Pemberley for 200 or maybe even 300 years, they'd probably amassed an awful lot of paperwork. It would be the kind of thing that would be stored in 20, 30, 40, 50 boxes maybe. If it had been deposited in, I suppose it would probably be the Derbyshire Record Office if Pemberley had existed in real life. The other thing that you find in record offices and archives is wills. And we definitely know that Darcy's father didn't make a will. When Lizzie refuses Darcy's first marriage proposal, Darcy finds that he has no option but to put the record straight about exactly what went on between him and Wickham in the past, and sort out those allegations that he had treated Wickham unkindly. Wickham has already told us at this point in the novel that Darcy's father had made a will. Darcy Senior imagined that young Wickham would take holy orders and would become a vicar, and I'm sure that Wickham went along with this just to keep Darcy's father sweet. And again, this also implies that Darcy's family were practising Anglicans. As a landed gentleman, Darcy Senior, particularly if he had the power to do this, would have been able to recommend certain candidates to fill vacancies for certain vicarages that might have been a gift that he had as part of his status as a landowner. A little like Lady Catherine de Bourgh, we seem to get the impression that she has chosen Mr. Collins to have the living at Hunsford, which is not far from where she lives at Rosing. Darcy's family are probably also able to do that as members of the Church of England. It's worth pointing out at this point that you did not have to be religious to be a vicar at this point in time. You didn't have to have any particular spiritual leanings to get into the church. Many people didn't, and many people actually went off and did all manner of other things. Bill Bryson's book At Home has got a really good section on that. If you get the chance, do have a look at that. It is somewhere on this bookshelf. Darcy Senior indicates in his will that the best parish, or living as it was called, that he could offer should go to Wickham, because Wickham was his godson and he obviously took a bit of a shine to Wickham. But Wickham says there was just such an informality in the terms of the bequest to give me no hope from law. Now, I'm not sure that I believe that. We find out later in the book that you shouldn't necessarily trust every word that comes out of George Wickham's mouth. Let us think about this. The Darcys are landed gentry. They have owned Pemberley for, I reckon, a good 200 years, if not longer. They are well educated. They are people that can afford really good legal advice. They are not the sort of people that are going to scribble a will down on the back of a cornflakes packet. Every clause in anybody's will in the Darcy family would have been absolutely watertight. There would be contingency plans in place in case the intended beneficiary of a will died leaving children or not leaving children, and if they didn't leave children it would go to their next eldest brother, and if they died without children it would go to the third eldest brother, and all these contingency plans that I've definitely come across in my own research. But Wickham says that Darcy chose to treat his father's directions in his will as merely conditional recommendation, and to assert that I had forfeited all claim to it by extravagance and imprudence. Now, that might be the case. Wickham uses the word conditional, and there were sometimes strings attached to bequests and wills. One of my ancestors, who actually owned a cotton factory in Lancashire, put a note in his will that was, frivolous in comparison to what Wickham was up to. But my ancestor particularly stated that his daughter should be disinherited if she married the local schoolmaster. I suspect that she had a bit of a crush on this local schoolmaster, and her father is a cotton factory owner, probably thought, I'm sorry Ellen, he is not good enough for you. You are a factory owner's daughter, and I am going to put this clause in my will to make sure that you can't marry him, or if you do marry him you're going to suffer financially for it. And strangely enough, Ellen didn't marry her schoolmaster. She ended up marrying a cotton factory owner, just like her dad, instead. People did pay attention to these clauses when their inheritance was at stake. And later on, Wickham also tells us in Pride and Prejudice that the parish that he should have had was in a place called Kimpton, which is implied to be in Derbyshire. Earlier on in the novel, when Elizabeth is relating to her sister Jane that her opinion is that Wickham has been badly treated by Darcy, Jane, who thinks wonderfully of everybody, even she suggests that Lizzie should exercise a bit of caution here. From what Mr. Bingley has told her, Wickham was left the living conditionally only, which is sort of backing up the idea that there was a caveat somewhere in Mr. Darcy Sr.'s will. It's not unreasonable at all to think that old Mr. Darcy ordered his lawyer to put some kind of clause into his will to say that Wickham couldn't claim the living if his behaviour was immoral, and maybe after his death, young Mr. Darcy, Fitzwilliam Darcy, chose to invoke that clause, as he would have had every right to do. Now, if Darcy Sr. can leave £1,000 to his godson, I doubt that he spared any expense to educate his own daughter, and Darcy Jr. does state that his sister Georgiana attended a school. And as mentioned in the marriage section of this series, Georgiana also got a dowry of £30,000, and it's likely that her father would also refer to this in his will. Maybe he would state how that was to be funded, what investments were to be cashed in order to provide that when the time came for her to get married. It could even be that some sort of investment was made when Georgiana was born, or maybe it's actually her own mother's dowry and it's just been left to gather interest for probably the best part of 30 years, because Darcy is 28, 29, so his parents would have been married at least 30 years before the book starts, or thereabouts. Finally, wills generally name at least 2 executors, and these are usually people who are trusted by the testator, and typically you would get a lengthy sentence or two in the document, usually right at the end, about how the testator is placing their trust in the executors to carry out their last wishes according to the instructions in the will, and lots of other legal jargon. And somewhere in that, I'm sure that if the document had existed, you would certainly have found that old Mr. Darcy had the names of his son and his nephew Colonel Fitzwilliam written down. They would have been there as nominated executors. He might have even appointed a third, his lawyer or somebody like that, just as extra insurance. Most wills you get at least 2 executors, sometimes you get others as well, so that is totally possible.